This is a gorgeous detail that some patterns have, so delicate and beautiful. And what you just saw can have several names out there, like continuous lap placket, found on sleeves. Easier to sew than what you think, and can add something special to a simple sleeve if you want to add it on. Or maybe you have patterns that have this detail and you haven't sewn them just because of that. Well, today we're going to see how to sew it. You'll be sewing these in no time. Hi sewing friends, I'm Karina from liftingpinsandneedles.com. Welcome to this channel that is all about sewing, limitless sewing. Today I want to bring you a super fun technique that you might find in some women's blouses. Well, it's actually only found in women's blouses. It is a more delicate way to finish this part and for you to get your hand over the cuff, different to a tower placket, which also serves the same purpose. It is a feature that you'll find both in women's and men's shirts. It's the same technique. They overlap towards the back. This one you won't find in men's clothing at all. It's got similar concepts though. You could actually use this technique to replace a tower placket on a pattern. Perfectly doable. I'll talk about that at the end. I am planning to do that. This one is simple. It doesn't involve interfacing pieces. You still need to do a little cut of sorts, but it's not hard at all. In different patterns, you'll see that different names are used for this technique, like continuous lap placket or continuous bound placket. For me, bound makes much more sense because you are actually binding that little area. Sometimes I've heard it be called continuous bound vent, which also makes a lot of sense for me because it is sort of like a vent. So you can find all those names, they mean the same, it is the same technique. The same way that we saw in the tower placket video, this detail is found on the back part of the sleeve. So it's going to be on this area of your arm, not on the front. This little bound placket is going to overlap towards the back also, so those are similar concepts for both techniques. You won't use a big piece like the tower placket that you need to interface. You will just use a small piece of binding. That binding can be cut on the bias or on the straight of grain. I've seen it done in both ways by different brands, different designers. I always lean towards cutting it on the straight of grain because it's just easier to handle. I don't really see why it needs to be cut on the bias. You know, this is a straight area on the garment. You're not conforming to any curve. So if you do see it on a pattern that it's got the arrow telling you to put it on the bias at 45 degrees, you can make the choice to cut it on the straight of grain, and I've done that many times. Works a treat, it looks exactly the same and it's just as nice. Around this detail, the continuous bound placket, you could find other details on the bottom of your sleeve. You could find gathers, you can find pleats. Whatever that detail is, that's secondary. It doesn't really affect the technique that we're going to see. Don't worry about that, leave it for the end. What is important is just this technique because it will be the same regardless of whatever other things you see here at the bottom. There will be a cuff, of course, there will always be a cuff there, and these cuffs can be super narrow. I've sewn some that are like not even an inch. It's really narrow. Some are a little wider and you have space for a buttonhole. Others are a little taller and you have space for 2 buttonholes. So those are things that can vary, but this technique we're going to see is exactly the same. Let's see some very general concepts. I'm using an example of a dress I made at the end of 2020, Holly dress from Fiber Mood. They actually had a piece cut on the straight of grain, so you know, I've seen it all. Let's see it. Here I'm just describing how your sleeve will look and the pieces that you need. Two sleeve pieces here, one on top of each other, right sides together. And on the bottom on this side is where the little slit needs to happen for that binding to be sewn on. Over there is the 2 notches for the sleeve. So whether you're doing a continuous bound placket, which is more delicate, or a tower placket, make sure that that detail, you've marked it correctly. It always should be towards the back side of the sleeve where you have the double notches, not towards the front. That's going to avoid you problems of getting confused and ending up with this placket here on this end because it's supposed to be at the back right there. So look at your sleeve, make sure your double notches are there and that's where you've marked it. These binding pieces, they're cut on the straight of grain, they're not biased. So making them straight of grain is so much easier to work with and they will just be more stable in this area. It doesn't need to conform to any curve because it is a straight slit there. So that was an extremely lightweight transparent chiffon. It can be done. It turned out really nice, amazing, delicate. Love how that looks. Now to see the whole sewing technique and the way that you can replicate this for other projects that you tackle, I'm going to use the example of the patina blouse from Friday Pattern Company. I made this one maybe in October last year. I have a video about it on the channel, a pattern review, but I didn't really touch on this technique. I know I didn't show it, so I've got it here in detail for you to see. You're going to see it's easier than what you think. There's only a few areas where you need to be careful when you're sewing the binding on, but nothing too hard. So let's see. Here is the sleeve piece. This is a long sleeve, quite wide here. It's going to be gathered into a cuff, and down here there's going to be a little slit that is going to be bound. Here are the two cuffs. This little piece here is the binding that's going to go on the slit of the sleeve at the bottom right there. You were supposed to cut it on the bias, but it also works if you cut it on the straight of grain, and I really wanted to have the contrast of this print on my sleeves. On this side is where you have the double notches for the back of the sleeve, and on this same edge is where you have a little slit there. I've drawn it with my friction pen, but I'm gonna do a sort of stitch right around it to stabilize the area before sewing on the binding there. Here you can see the line that's marked on the pattern piece to do the slit. This is gonna have binding, and I don't want to just cut into that. I want to stabilize it and sew around it like a tiny hair away from the line, and then pivot. Okay, that's how that looks, and now I'm gonna be careful to cut right in the middle of this. And now this can extend and we can sew the binding there. Here are the two binding pieces. I have them cut on the straight of grain. It still will work on the straight of grain or on the bias. It doesn't really matter, we're not going around curved areas here. I put a pin there in the middle just to know, so I can match that to the middle. And I'm gonna put this right on top there, match this middle of the slit to the middle of the binding piece right there, put a pin. I always cut my binding a tad longer. I always prefer to have a bit left over and then trim that off at the very end. So I'm just gonna pin this and sew with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I want to sew with the slit of the sleeve on the top so I can see this part, because I'm gonna have to maneuver the fabric at this point so you don't get a pucker or a little pleat right there. This is the area where you need to be careful, and I'm gonna make the seam allowance a little bit smaller there and hand crank up to that middle section, lift the presser foot, shuffle the fabric away, and then the next stitch is by hand, making sure the needle falls clean into fabric and not a pucker or a pleat. So that's sewn there, and now we fold this raw edge and then fold this onto itself over here, and that's how we can finish this binding. Fold it again until you meet the seam. This is why I wanted to use this part of the fabric so that it contrasts on the sleeve, so you can see this little bound area. Okay, I've got both of my binding folded to the inside like that. That fold is covering the seam slightly to make sure that when I top stitch from the right side, I'm going to be catching everything. So I'll be sewing right on the edge or along this binding. Okay, so that's been sewn. Now what we do is fold these right sides together like this, match it up here in the center, move this out as much as you can, and now we do a diagonal seam right there. When I've done this with other lightweight wovens like chiffon, I do it by hand, but in this case I'm just going to do it with the machine, 45-degree angle. So it forms like a little V there, but that's not how it's going to be. One of them is going to go over the other. When you look at the bottom of the sleeve, you will have a short area and a long area. The part of the binding that is attached to the short area of the sleeve stays flat like that. It's the other one that's attached to the long area of the sleeve that gets folded in and overlaps this side. So make sure you just pin this folded so that when we put the cuff, we don't forget. This is the one that's going to stay like that. So when we take the other sleeve, it's just the opposite. We have the short end here. This is the side of the binding that stays normal. This other side is the one that gets folded in and will overlap like that. After pinning that, we'll forget about that for now. We need to put our sleeve together and align the long seam that sleeves have, sew it and serge it. And then we can gather the bottom part of this sleeve into the cuff. After sewing the seam of the sleeve, I'm doing the gathering stitches on the bottom of the sleeve. I'm starting about an inch away from these slits and then ending about an inch away from the slits so the gathers don't go all the way up to there. I'm doing the first row at 1/4 inch from the edge and the second row at 5/8 like always. And then I'll repeat with the other sleeve. Okay, here I have the bottom of one sleeve. Here are the ends of the slits, and remember one of them has been pinned folded. It's supposed to be like that. And then I have a cuff piece. I've taken any of the long ends and just folded it up by 3/8 of an inch like that. I've also done a guide stitch to help me press. As all guide stitches, they can just come out really quickly. I'm going to fold my cuff in half, put a pin. I've done the same to the sleeve. You can see that's the center of the sleeve. Now the way I like to do it is I like to put the cuff right sides to wrong sides like this. I'll just match it up. When this is sewn, this is going to flip over to the outside like this, and then I can top stitch. So match up the center right here of the sleeve and the cuff. Over here the cuff will be behind the sleeve. You need to let the cuff protrude for 3/8 of an inch right there. Use that same pin. This is the side of the binding that's folded, and on the other side the binding is going to be normal. At the other side you also need to let the cuff protrude by 3/8 right there. And here you see the excess that is going to be gathered into here. As I did with the back piece, I like to gather from one side to the center, from the other side to the center, until all the sleeve is gathered into there. This particular sleeve has a lot of ease here at the bottom. It will have quite a lot of gathers. Look at all those gathers. It's going to be quite gathered there. So that's on one side and then on the other side. So now I'll just pin this and we'll sew this at 3/8 from one end to the other end. So the cuff is sewn. Now it needs to be folded this way, but first we got to sort out these short little bits. So keeping the wrong sides facing up, we put the right sides together, we align these two folds, and then we sew these short ends. Same as on this side, align the short end. So now we just fold this and flip it, and we'll get a nice little crisp corner right there for the cuff. And then this seam is going to cover this and cover all these gathers right there. So I'm just going to take my time and match it up, hand baste it, and then we can sew the cuff on, top stitch it. After hand basting the cuff, I'm just going to sew all around the cuff like a rectangle. I'm using the presser foot that helps me sew on the edge again, and I'm just going through all these corners until this is done. So this side of the binding that was folded, that overlaps over that one. So when you sew a continuous bound placket on a solid and you do it neatly, you are going to see it. If you're using a print, you might not see it. It might just get lost in the print. So if I'm using a print, I try to find an area of the print that is slightly different so that it can contrast and you can see the detail there. I would like it to show. If you're putting an effort doing something so beautiful, it's nice that people can see it, right? It's a good idea to find a different area of the print if you can, and that's what I've done with the patina blouse right there. Now the patina blouse had you cut it on the bias, I cut it on the straight of grain, perfectly fine. Now that we know how to sew it, you might have patterns that have this as a detail. You might have just kept them there and thought that was too hard. Well, I hope this helps you and you can get those patterns out and start doing this because it's so beautiful. I've made a lot of these, and since I've started my channel, I have a few. The perfect tunic from Wardrobe by Me, that one has it, and it's so pretty, very beautiful. Also got the Mila shirt from Itch to Stitch that has this detail. And just recently, also by Itch to Stitch, the Galicia blouse also has this beautiful detail here on the sleeve. So it is really nice if you're looking to up your skills in woven and you're looking to make yourself some beautiful long sleeves, nice floaty fabrics. This is so beautiful to have there, and I hope it helps. But what if you're more adventurous? What if you want to add this to just a regular sleeve, right? What if you have a garment that you want to make and you want to have a little bit of fun and add something special? I'm going to show you how you can apply this technique to other patterns that don't have it and make that sleeve extra special. In the example that I'm going to show you, I'm using a pattern that has a bishop sleeve as an option. Bishop sleeve is usually from the armhole down, quite straight down, and then at the end you have a casing with elastic, and that brings it in here. You don't have an extra cuff or anything, but you do have gathers here that are created with that elastic, making it narrow here around your wrist. What I can do there is just measure that sleeve, maybe make it a little shorter to account for the extra you're gonna add from a cuff. And I'm going to show you how you can easily just draw the line. You have to cut your little slit, how you can make your own binding. So easy. Maybe you can borrow the cuff from another pattern. Maybe you can make your own cuff. In just a few minutes, I'm going to show you how you can add this to a pattern that doesn't have this detail. It's nice if the pattern already has a wide sleeve because it's just going to look nicer. If it's a really slim sleeve, I would just leave it as is. But a nice bishop sleeve is a good sleeve to add this to, so let's see. If you have a pattern where you have a bishop sleeve where it's just a really wide sleeve, you can see this one goes straight down, it doesn't slant in like regular sleeves. Sometimes you just have to do a casing and put an elastic there. You might want to go the extra mile and do this bound vent with a cuff. I think it's a really nice addition if you have time. I have a sleeve here. I have double notches there. So that means that this is the back of the sleeve and this is where we're going to draw the slit. I'm going to give you measurements as reference that are going to work with whatever sleeve. So from this edge, just measure 4 inches in and then just take a ruler that has a square area with a 90 degrees and just square it along the bottom. 5 inches is good. So here you can see my line. This is where I'm going to stay stitch around it, snip into and do my binding. Just measure how long this is, double it and add a little bit and create your binding piece. I'm going to show you the binding piece I've created for this one. Okay, so here you can see the line I drew. It was 5 inches long. So you're going to have binding that is going to go both sides, up and down. So you basically want your binding to be double and a little more. I like to cut mine a little longer that I can just trim away after. I don't want to cut it the exact same length. So I basically have 10 inches that would be double that plus an inch. So this is an inch, this is 11 inches long. And how tall it is? 1.5 inches. If you cut your binding piece 1.5 inches tall, the technique I've shown you in the video is going to work. So you can create your own. It's just a rectangle. There's nothing really complex about making your own rectangle. One easy way to sort out your cuff is just borrow the cuff from another pattern, and that is what I'm going to do. I'm just going to take the long sleeve cuff from the Aria button down that I've sewn a few times and I already know. So if you can tell, this is a pretty long cuff. It's going to be longish there on your wrist. It's going to fit 2 buttons, which I think is pretty. This one's about 6.5 inches there. But once you have it sewn, of course, it will be folded and you take away seam allowance. You know, you have a certain length there. This one's 3.5 inches tall. This one, of course, when you fold it in half and sew it and you take away seam allowance, it's going to end up super narrow like that. It'll just fit 1 button. Now, if you don't have a cuff piece and you want to make your own, just take your wrist measurement. You never want your cuff to be like that. It would be super uncomfortable. My wrist is 7 inches. I would add, just to be comfortable, at least 3 inches of ease there. So your cuff piece would be 11 inches in my case because mine measures 7. So just measure your own, add the ease, and that's how you get a length that's customized to you. How tall your cuff is, that's where you can also customize as well. So you can see that you just need to make sure you are making your line on the back part of the sleeve where you have the double notches. Measure 4 inches in, draw your line. 5 inches is a good length for a vent. I've measured a few of the ones I have in my wardrobe and they tend to go between 4.5 to 5 inches. So 5 inches is fine, you'll be fine. Make your binding, double that, plus a little more so you can have a little bit extra. You can just trim it off. I find it nicer like that. And add a cuff. Whether you have one from a pattern, whether you make it yourself, measure your wrist, add the ease, create rectangles. You can create rectangles. They aren't curves, they're not special shapes. Rectangles are just rectangles, and you can make your own binding and make your own cuffs. I'm going to show you a sleeve. I just filmed a little bit so you can see what is coming. I'm so excited to sew this garment. I'm using a really nice silk material I've had in my stash for a pretty long time. It's so nice, it's black and it's got little splatters of white paint print on it. It's a silk chiffon. You can see it on the screen now, and I cut out a garment and I'm going to show you what my sleeve pieces look like. This is a sleeve that was originally a bishop sleeve with a casing and an elastic, but I'm using it because it's wide. it will allow a lot of gathers at the bottom. And for an extra detail here on the back part of the sleeve, where we have the double notch, if you look down here, I have drawn the slit that I've shown you that I marked on my paper pattern. That's marked there really faintly, but I'm going to be able to see it. There is my binding. I cut this binding from the selvage of the silk, which is a little bit different in the print, and I think that's going to look really nice. I want the detail to contrast and be seen. This is the cuff piece from the Aria button down from Love Notions. I know it fits me well. I know it's long enough to have 2 buttons. That is what I'm going to sew there. And I'll do it in the exact same way you saw in the tutorial. I'm just adding this on to a pattern that doesn't have it. I think it's going to look amazing. So this pattern doesn't have the continuous bound placket as a detail or a cuff. It just has that nice bishop sleeve, which is also nice. And you are going to see the completed garment very soon, very soon, in a couple of hours. Don't say I told you, but it might be the Feature Friday pattern from Love Notions. If it is already live when this video goes up, I will have it linked down below so that you know it's a Rhapsody blouse. And I will show you my completed garment in the next video. I'm also going to show you how I'm pre-washing the silk. You know, silk is not just a fabric you just chuck in the machine and put in the dryer. You can definitely do it at home. It's so easy. So we're gonna see a little bit about silk and my silk blouse with the continuous bound placket in the next video. See you again very soon. Bye.